Jimmy Carter is one of those presidents who I feel got a lot more hate than he deserved for his time in office. As we celebrate his legacy and mourn his passing this week, I'd like to highlight some things that we often overlook about his administration. Growing up just outside of Atlanta, Georgia, my social studies classes always placed a pretty big emphasis on Carter's legacy. After all, he is the only president we've ever had from Georgia, and his upbringing as a peanut farmer paints a very idealistic tale of the state's farming communities. But honestly, I don't remember a whole lot about him from my time in grade school, so I've been doing some research into his legacy, and let me tell you, there is so much to talk about here. Today, you'll probably hear about his big-ticket accomplishments, the ones everyone usually talks about, like freeing the hostages in Iran, his work for Habitat for Humanity, and the Camp David Accords, which, looking back on, it feels insane that he was able to come to any sort of agreement there. I absolutely applaud and admire his humanitarian work, but I think one of the most impactful things that he did on the domestic side is his handling of the energy crisis during his administration. His handling of the situation jump-started the move towards sustainable energy and transportation that we're still fighting for to this day. But let's take a step back and start with his tenure as governor of Georgia. Carter arrived in the state capital at a pivotal time for Atlanta, as legislators were in the final stretch of the push to create a rapid transit system. We now know this as MARTA, Atlanta's subway system. However, at the time, there was a debate about how much of the system's funding should come from the state versus a sales tax of 3/4 of a penny, which is a huge mouthful to say. I found a lot of different sources on this that each tell the story in a slightly different light, so it's hard to tell exactly what Carter's attitude and motivation was in this decision, but basically, there were a bunch of state representatives who, in their rural, southern racial prejudice, didn't want to provide state funding to Atlanta residents, many of whom were black. There was also some discussion about the state not having adequate funds for the program in the first place, so Governor Carter, quote, offered to raise the sales tax to a full penny if the state didn't have to pay. Obviously, this was not an ideal solution, and some credit the decision as screwing MARTA out of future state funding. However, I do think that Carter came to this decision more out of necessity. After all, he came from a more progressive ideology and focused a great deal of effort on racial justice. Even on transit issues, Carter later developed a close relationship with the mayor of Los Angeles, and they considered him a key ally in their agenda for Los Angeles with regards to funding the city's first subway line. Yet, Ethan Elkind, in his book Railtown on the history of LA Metro Rail, credits the struggle around Atlanta's MARTA system as causing Carter to think twice about funding new rail programs in auto-oriented cities. Although, importantly, I can't find sufficient substantiation for that claim, so I suspect that might just be Elkind's inference. Regardless, I do think it's safe to say that Jimmy Carter's support of transit at this point was waning, and it wasn't much of a top priority for him towards the mid-1970s. One thing that never waned during his governorship was his environmentalism, as Carter heavily regulated coastal wetlands and set aside hundreds of acres for wildlife conservation. You might say, what does this have to do with public transportation? Well, his relationship between sustainability and transit mainly developed during his time as president. He initially criticized American mass transportation projects as grossly overdesigned in a 1977 leaked memo, and his initial response to the energy crisis focused more on wasting less energy and reducing dependency on fossil fuels. At the time, climate change wasn't as prevalent in the public consciousness as it is today, but still, I give him credit for choosing renewable energy instead of slashing oil embargoes to drive gas prices down, as I imagine other presidents might have done. Like, if we all ran into an oil shortage today, I honestly expect our leaders to double down on gas subsidies, despite knowing much more about the harmful effects of climate change. In 1978, Carter signed the National Energy Act, which mandated auto efficiency, increased solar energy, and reduced dependency on oil, all of which we are still arguing about to this day. What we do see here is at least some linking of transportation issues with environmental issues, but it's still focused on cars. That is, however, until we get to the 1979 oil crisis. The Iranian Revolution caused a significant decrease in the country's oil production, and since they produced a lot of the world's oil, gas prices skyrocketed. Combined with a national panic, Americans started to hoard gas, leading to even longer lines at the pump. This event caused President Carter to finally undergo a change of heart when it came to funding mass transit, and his administration subsequently played a large role in greenlighting LA's first subway line, which eventually opened in 1993. Side note, but if you're wondering why it took 14 years to build Los Angeles' first subway, it's because of President Reagan. He systematically underfunded transit projects and led to significant delays. Combined with his trickle-down economics, overall conservatism, and racial prejudices, it was not a good time. I guess elections really do have consequences. President Carter also signed legislation that established the Windfall Tax and Energy Trust Fund that used taxes on oil companies to fund other transit projects across the nation. His administration also helped shift funds from highway projects to mass transportation. It's safe to say that the 1979 energy crisis finally caused Carter to use public transit as a key method to reduce energy consumption and create a better environment. And I would argue that his work on the federal level set the stage for transit being linked more strongly with the sustainability movement after the Reagan and Bush senior administrations, of course. In fact, in 1979, President Carter said, "Better urban planning, lower inflation, an improved environment, wider employment, and increased mobility for the young, the elderly, the handicapped, the poor, and members of minority groups were all key benefits of public transportation." That sounds exactly like the kinds of talking points that urbanists and transit advocates are using today. Isn't it crazy how we're still arguing about these things and trying to get politicians to listen to these issues? It's only with the Biden administration that America finally got widespread federal support on transit and sustainability with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which is the biggest infrastructure investment since the New Deal. I visited the Carter Center and Presidential Library in Atlanta last year, and it was a really great experience to see how his legacy has evolved over time. While there, I picked up some books, one of which is A Government as Good as Its People. It's basically a collection of speeches Carter made up until his inauguration, and to cap off this video, I thought it'd be nice to read some quotes from this book that I found particularly moving. While at the Jekyll Island Lions Convention in June of 1971, Governor Carter said the following: "There is a mandatory relationship between the powerful and the influential, and the socially prominent and wealthy on the one hand, and the weak and insecure and the poor on the other hand. This is a relationship not always completely understood. I don't completely understand it myself, but I know that in a free society, we do see very clearly that one cannot accept great blessings bestowed on him by God without feeling an inner urge and drive to share those blessings with others of our neighbors who are not quite so fortunate as we." In an age where we're constantly seeing billionaires and corporations sucking up to the president-elect, it's nice to remember we once had a president who was so committed to giving back to his community. God, I hate that we have to call this guy the president-elect again. Another very apropos quote comes from the speech Carter gave at the Town Hall Forum in Los Angeles after he gained the Democratic nomination for president. He said, "Today, as we face the election of 1976, I think there's a feeling in the land, much like those of 1932 and 1960, that we face an economic crisis and that we are drifting and need to get moving again. But there's something more than that. After all we've been through in recent years, we need to have our faith in government restored. We want to believe once again that our national leaders are honorable and competent and deserving of our trust. For if we cannot believe in that, little else matters." I swear it feels like we could have heard this in this election cycle, or the 2020 election. Finally, at the National Conference of Bankruptcy Judges in Atlanta, Governor Carter said this: "There is a great tendency for all of us to shy away from controversial issues, but I tell you that every issue that is worth anything is bound to be controversial. Too often we avoid taking a stand for what we know to be right because we are afraid we're going to lose a dollar or a client or a vote. And at that moment when we profess our willingness to trade that friend, that dollar, that client, or that vote for a piece of our soul, we lose another chunk out of whatever it is that gives us the right to call ourselves men. No city, no state, no country can afford men in the professions, in business, or in politics who are more afraid of controversy than of their conscience." The United States lost a great president on December 29th, and in many ways it's going to feel like we're trading him for a corrupt caricature of American insincerity on January 20th. All I can really say is that I hope we come out the other side and one day get a president as just and virtuous as President Carter.